9 years ago, I was just a 17-year-old kid trying to make sense of the world. My younger brother, Jake, was only 10 at the time. We were dealing with something no family should go through. Our mom passed away after battling an illness for what felt like forever. It was a dark, painful time that seemed like it would never end. After losing her, everything felt out of place, and life didn't really make much sense. It wasn't long before Dad decided it was time for a fresh start. Within a year, he got remarried, and suddenly, I found myself with a new stepmom, Vanessa, and a stepbrother named Luke, who was around my age. The transition wasn't easy, but I surprised myself by adjusting pretty well. Vanessa wasn't all that bad, and Luke seemed decent enough. We'd even have dinner together as a family, and for a moment, it almost felt normal. But everything changed on my 18th birthday. That's when Dad blindsided me with an announcement. I had to pack my stuff and leave. No warning, no explanation, just like that. I remember the shock and confusion as I tried to process his words. I'd barely turned into an adult, and suddenly, I was being pushed out of the only home I knew. Fortunately, my boyfriend Chris stepped in when I needed him the most. He didn't think twice and welcomed me into his place. It was a lifeline. But I knew I had to stand on my own feet, so I enrolled in college, juggling part-time jobs and classes to make ends meet. It was tough. Every day felt like an uphill battle. There were countless nights I stayed up, poring over textbooks while working long shifts just to pay for tuition. But I made it through. 4 years later, I graduated debt-free and ready to start a new chapter. Landing my first job as a manager was a game changer. It was more than just a paycheck. It was proof that I could take on life and win. The salary was solid, way better than I'd ever imagined. I paid off my student loans and even put some money aside for the future. Through all this, Jake was my anchor. He was the only family I had left, the one constant through everything that life threw at us. Then, in July 2019, Jake called me out of the blue, dropping a bombshell. Our dad was kicking him out too, just like he did with me. I felt that old anger boiling up inside. It was deja vu, and I couldn't believe Dad would pull the same move again. Without hesitation, Chris and I opened our doors to Jake, laying down a few rules. No trouble, help out around the house, and keep up his grades. And you know what? He delivered. He crushed it at school, acing his classes, and even landed a part-time job to help out with groceries. It was like having a new version of the little brother I always knew. More responsible, more determined. As for Dad, we barely spoke. But Luke and I kept in touch here and there. He'd grown into a good friend, despite the weird family dynamics. Things were relatively calm until last summer when Jake was preparing to start college. I made him a promise. I'd cover his tuition, as long as he kept his end of the deal and stayed on track. He did more than that. He killed it. Straight A's across the board. Then somehow word got out to Dad, Vanessa, and Luke about me footing Jake's college bill, and that's when the drama exploded. I got a call from Vanessa expecting me to do the same for Luke. It caught me completely off guard. I didn't even know what to say at first. It was one thing to support my brother because, well, he's family, but paying for Luke's education? It wasn't the same for me. I didn't have that kind of bond with him. He was a stepbrother, someone I liked, sure, but not someone I felt a deep sense of responsibility for. I told her no. And that's when all hell broke loose. Within hours, my phone was lighting up like a Christmas tree. Aunts, uncles, cousins, even people I hadn't spoken to in years were calling, blasting me for playing favorites, making it seem like I was the bad guy in this story. It was overwhelming, and no matter how I tried to explain myself, it was like talking to a brick wall. The accusations kept coming, and every time I put my foot down, it only seemed to make things worse. It was exhausting. I felt like I was losing my grip on the situation, being cast as the villain for something I didn't think was wrong. But it wasn't just about the money. No one seemed to get that. They made it all about who I was willing to help and who I wasn't, but I had my reasons, and I wasn't backing down. To make things even messier, Luke was still living at home with Dad and Vanessa, and he had just turned 18. All the people blowing up my phone? Yeah, they were all on their side. My mom's side of the family, the few I reached out to when I got kicked out, never even responded back then. Now, all of a sudden, they were interested in me again. But not in a good way. Feeling overwhelmed. I took a step back and started looking at how they'd even found out in the first place. How did Vanessa know I was paying for Jake's tuition? I hadn't told anyone except Chris, Jake, and the bank. Then I found out that Vanessa's friend who worked at the college had spilled the beans. It was a massive violation of privacy, and I was furious. I'm even considering legal action against her for this. But that's a whole different story. What really threw me was when I looked back at all the messages from extended family. There was something off. It wasn't just them being nosy or opinionated. The way they were piling on blame and guilt, making it sound like I was somehow in the wrong for not paying Luke's way through college. It felt orchestrated, like I was being set up. I decided to get everyone on a Zoom call to clear things up. And that's when I got the real shocker. Dad had been feeding them a completely different story, making it sound like I just left because I didn't want to be around anymore, like I ditched them on a whim. He did the same thing when he kicked Jake out, painting me as the selfish, ungrateful daughter who abandoned the family for no reason. No wonder no one reached out. They'd all bought into his lies, and I couldn't even blame them. 9 years went by, and not one of them reached out to hear my side. Not one. That's when I realized there was no fixing this. It was time to let them go. So I went no contact, blocked every number, every social media account. I didn't want to hear from them again. Even after all this, Dad, Vanessa, and Luke kept blowing up my phone, trying to change my mind, to guilt trip me into staying connected. But I was done. Jake and I had a long talk, and we both agreed cutting ties was the only way forward. It was hard, especially with Luke. We'd been tight, almost like real brothers, but in the end, he chose them over me. That hurt. Maybe he was just in it for the money after all. If he really cared, wouldn't he have stood up for me? Wouldn't he have stayed neutral at least? But no. When it came down to it, he took their side. And then they tried to twist the knife even more, saying if Luke didn't land a good job after college, it would be my fault. That's when I knew, beyond any doubt, I was done playing their games. Next week, Chris, Jake, and I are moving to a new city, about 45 minutes away. A fresh start, far from all this chaos. It's been in the works for a while now, long before the family drama kicked off. We've been planning this move for our own reasons, not to run away from them. We didn't tell anyone, and we're not planning to. As far as I'm concerned, they've already faded into the background, just like a bad memory. This new chapter? It's going to be just us. Our little crew. For the first time in a long while, I'm feeling hopeful. Moving away was the best decision I've made in years. Getting out of that toxic environment felt like shedding a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying. For the first time in a long time, it felt like I could breathe again. Jake, Chris, and I settled into our new place pretty quickly. The three of us were building a life together, one that was finally drama-free, or so I thought. About a week after we moved, I got a call from Luke. At first, I didn't pick up. I hadn't heard from him since everything went down with Dad and Vanessa, but he kept calling, and curiosity got the better of me, so I finally answered. "Hey, I just want to talk," he said. His voice was tense, like he was bracing himself for a fight. Talk about what? I wasn't in the mood for more guilt trips or accusations, but he didn't sound angry, just desperate. "I'm sorry for everything." That threw me off. I'd spent the past few weeks mentally preparing for more battles, for more manipulation, but I hadn't expected an apology. And it wasn't just the words, it was the tone. It sounded genuine, like he really meant it. But I'd been burned too many times to just accept it at face value. "Sorry for what exactly?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "For not sticking up for you, for siding with them." I was wrong, and I see that now. He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I was scared, okay? They're all I have. And when they turned on you, I thought I had to choose." "Yeah, well, you did choose, didn't you?" I shot back, trying to keep my emotions in check. "You didn't even try to hear my side." "I know," he said quietly. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I regret it." There was a long silence between us. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and I could feel something in me softening. But I wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. "Okay," I said finally. "Thanks for saying that. I mean it." he insisted. I want to make it right. If there's anything I can do, just give me time, I interrupted, cutting him off. I need time to process all this. Of course, he agreed quickly. Take all the time you need. We ended the call on that note, and I sat there staring at my phone, feeling more conflicted than ever. Part of me wanted to believe him. The Luke I knew before all this happened was a good guy, and I missed that person. But another part of me, the part that had spent years being let down and betrayed, couldn't let go of the bitterness. For the next few days, I found myself thinking about him more than I wanted to admit. What if he really had been caught in the middle? What if he was just as manipulated by Dad and Vanessa as I was? I kept going back and forth in my mind, trying to decide if I should give him another chance or cut him out completely. And then Jake came to me with more news that threw me for a loop. Luke wants to meet up, he told me one evening, looking nervous. Just the two of us. He says he wants to talk things out. My gut reaction was to say no. After everything, I didn't trust Luke, not enough to let Jake see him alone. But Jake was insistent. I think I should go, he said firmly. He reached out to me first, and I want to hear what he has to say. Jake, I don't want you getting sucked back into their mess, I warned, my protective instincts flaring up. They're not our family anymore. I know, he said quietly, but I need to do this, for closure. I hated the idea, but I knew better than to stand in his way. Jake wasn't a kid anymore. He was 19, practically an adult. I couldn't keep shielding him from everything, no matter how much I wanted to. Okay, I agreed reluctantly, but keep your guard up, and let me know the second things start getting weird. He promised, and a few days later he went to meet Luke at a cafe in the city. I spent the entire time pacing the living room, my stomach tied in knots. Chris tried to distract me, but I couldn't focus on anything until I knew Jake was safe. He finally came back that evening, and the look on his face was one I hadn't seen in a long time. Hopeful, almost relieved. Well? I demanded as soon as he walked through the door. How did it go? Jake sat down on the couch, running a hand through his hair. It was good. Better than I expected. He was honest, really honest. Said he felt trapped between us and them, and he's been miserable ever since we cut him off. So what? He wants back in now? I crossed my arms, trying not to let my skepticism show. Kind of, Jake admitted, but he's not asking for anything. He just wants a chance to prove he's on our side. He even offered to help with our legal bills. I blinked in surprise. That I hadn't seen coming. Where did he get the money? Apparently, a relative of his left him a small inheritance, Jake explained. He said he doesn't care about the money. He just wants to show us that he's serious. I didn't know what to say. On one hand, I wanted to believe him. But on the other hand, I'd been burned so many times by people I trusted that I didn't know if I could take that risk again. So what do you think? I asked Jake quietly. I think we should give him a chance, he said softly. Not a big one, just a chance to show us he's changed. I took a deep breath, considering his words. Maybe he was right. Maybe, just maybe, Luke deserved an opportunity to prove himself. But it wasn't going to be easy, and I wasn't going to let my guard down anytime soon. All right, I agreed slowly. We'll see how it goes, but the second he does anything shady, we're done. No more second chances. Deal, Jake said, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. Thanks, sis. Over the next few weeks, Luke started coming around more often. He didn't push or pry, he just showed up, ready to help out however he could. He'd drop by with groceries or offer to pitch in around the house, never asking for anything in return. Slowly but surely, I felt my walls coming down, bit by bit. Maybe he really had changed. But I wasn't going to let myself get too comfortable. I kept my guard up, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that people can surprise you. In both good and bad ways. Just when I thought things were settling down, a letter arrived in the mail from Dad. I almost didn't open it. After everything, I wasn't sure I wanted to know what he had to say, but curiosity got the best of me, and I tore it open, my heart pounding. It was full of apologies and empty promises. I'm sorry for everything, let's talk, let's fix this. I crumpled it up and threw it away without a second thought. I wasn't interested in his half-hearted attempts to play nice. Not now, not after everything he'd put us through. but that letter was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more letters started showing up. Vanessa sent one too, full of the same hollow words. Luke told us they'd been talking about trying to make amends ever since the lawsuit, ever since we cut ties for good. They were trying to worm their way back in, bit by bit, but I wasn't having it. Let them say whatever they want, I told Jake one night. It doesn't change anything. I know, he agreed, but it still sucks. Yeah, it did. It sucked a lot. But I wasn't about to let them back in just because they were feeling guilty. This was our fresh start, our clean slate. And I wasn't going to let them ruin it again. Just when it seemed like things were finally starting to settle down, life threw us another curveball. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find Jake looking unusually tense. He was pacing around the living room, his face creased with worry. "What's up?" I asked, tossing my bag onto the couch. "Did something happen?" He hesitated, and that's when I knew it was serious. Jake wasn't the type to get rattled easily. "It's about Luke," he finally said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. My stomach dropped. Things had been going surprisingly well between us and Luke. After all the bad blood, I'd started to let my guard down just a little. We weren't exactly back to being close, but there was this fragile, tentative truce between us. "What about him?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "He called," Jake said, sighing. "He sounded, I don't know, lost, scared. He wouldn't tell me much, just that he's thinking about leaving home." That caught me off guard. Luke was still living with Dad and Vanessa, and as far as I knew, they'd been pushing him pretty hard to keep things together on their end. The idea of him wanting to leave, it didn't fit with the picture I'd built in my head. Leaving? Why? I pressed, my mind racing. "What's going on over there?" "I don't know," Jake said, sounding frustrated. "But he asked if we could meet up, said he really needs to talk to you." A part of me wanted to shut it down right there. I was tired of the drama, the endless cycle of guilt and manipulation. But another part of me, the part that still cared about the kid I used to think of as a brother, couldn't let it go. "All right," I agreed slowly. "Tell him we'll meet, but I'm not making any promises." Jake nodded and texted Luke while I tried to sort through the mess of emotions churning inside me. What was he up to? Was this some new scheme cooked up by Dad and Vanessa? Or was Luke really on his own this time? We met up the next day at a small coffee shop downtown. I hadn't seen Luke in person for a while, and when he walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked thinner, paler, almost haunted. "Hey," he said quietly, sliding into the chair across from me. Jake had stayed back this time, giving us some space to talk. It was just the two of us, staring each other down like strangers who'd met by chance. "Hey," I replied cautiously. "So, what's this all about?" Luke took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. "I'm leaving," he said bluntly. "I can't stay with them anymore. It's too much." My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of anger and concern. "What's going on, Luke? What did they do?" "It's not just what they did, it's what they keep doing," he said, his voice cracking. "Ever since you guys cut contact, it's like they've been spiraling. They're obsessed with making you pay, with dragging you back into their mess, and I'm stuck in the middle. I can't take it anymore." "What are you saying?" I leaned forward, trying to catch his gaze. Are they trying to come after us legally or something?" No, nothing like that," Luke said quickly. "But they talk about you all the time. About Jake, about how you abandoned the family, how you're ruining everything. It's like they're obsessed with making you the villain. They twist everything. It's like they're living in some twisted version of reality where they're the victims and you're the enemy." I stared at him, stunned. I knew Dad and Vanessa could be manipulative, but this was on a whole different level. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked quietly. "Why didn't you say anything before?" "I was scared," he admitted, his eyes pleading with me to understand. "I didn't want to lose them, even though I knew they were wrong. But I can't do it anymore, okay? I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." He looked so broken, so desperate, that it made my chest ache. For all the anger and resentment I'd built up toward him. In that moment, I just felt sad. Sad for the kid who'd been caught between us, for the person he could have been if things had turned out differently. "So what now?" I asked softly. "What do you want from me, Luke?" He hesitated, biting his lip. "I don't want anything from you. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I know I can't undo the past, but I don't want to be a part of their game anymore. I want out." I took a deep breath, staring at him across the table. Part of me wanted to pull him in, to tell him it was okay, that he could be part of our lives again. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt too many times, kept holding back. "You don't have to decide anything now," he said quickly, sensing my hesitation. "I get it if you don't want to trust me, but I'm leaving. I'm going to move out and get my own place. I wanted you to know." I nodded slowly, my mind spinning. This wasn't what I expected, not at all. I had no idea what to say, what to feel, so I just nodded again, silently, and watched as he stood up. "I'll keep in touch, okay?" he said awkwardly. Just take care." Then he turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving me sitting there alone, staring blankly at the empty chair in front of me. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't know if I should believe him, if I should give him another chance, or if this was just another trick. But something in his eyes, something raw and vulnerable, made me think that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth this time. When I got back home, Jake was waiting anxiously. "Well, what did he say?" "He's leaving," I told him, still in a daze. "He's moving out. Says he's done with Dad and Vanessa." Jake's eyes widened. "Seriously?" "Yeah," I murmured. He seemed different, like he really meant it. "So what now?" Jake asked cautiously. Are we going to help him?" I hesitated, the conflict tearing me apart. Could I really open that door again? Could I trust Luke after everything? "I don't know," I said finally. "I just don't know." For the next few days, I kept my distance, giving myself time to process. Luke texted a few times, just short updates about how he was looking for apartments, how he was planning to leave within the month. He didn't ask for anything, didn't push. He just kept me in the loop. And then, one day, I got a message that changed everything. It was from Vanessa. "I know you've been talking to Luke," the text read. "If you think you can steal him away from us, you're dead wrong. You might have gotten rid of your father and me, but you won't take him too. He's ours." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just the words. It was the malice behind them, the sheer spite. I read the message over and over, my heart pounding. This wasn't about family. This was about control. It always had been. I showed the message to Jake, my hands shaking. "They're not going to let him go," I whispered. "They're going to do whatever it takes to pull him back." "What do we do?" Jake asked, his face pale. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to do. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If we were going to help Luke break free, we had to be ready for whatever came next. After Vanessa's chilling message, I realized that this was no longer just about Luke trying to break free. It was about all of us. For years, Dad and Vanessa had been pulling the strings, manipulating everything to suit their twisted narrative. But this time, we weren't going to play by their rules. Jake and I had a long, serious conversation that night. We knew we couldn't just stand by and watch as Vanessa tried to reel Luke back in. But stepping in meant exposing ourselves to the drama we'd fought so hard to escape. "Are we really going to do this?" Jake asked quietly, sitting on the edge of his bed. His face was set, determined, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. "Are we really going to help him?" "I don't know," I admitted, pacing back and forth. "But if we don't, then what? He goes back to them, and they'll just keep tightening their grip until he has no way out." Jake nodded slowly, then looked up at me. "So, what's the plan?" We hashed it out, going over every possible scenario, every potential fallout. The goal was simple: help Luke get out for good, but it wouldn't be easy. Vanessa was relentless, and Dad was a wild card. There was no telling how far they'd go to keep him tethered to them. But for the first time, I felt a spark of hope. If Luke really wanted out, then maybe we could pull this off. The next day, I called him. "Hey, Luke, I said carefully, keeping my tone casual. So, I got a weird message from Vanessa. You doing okay over there? He hesitated, then sighed heavily. I'm fine, but things have been tense. They're mad that I've been talking to you and Jake. They're more than mad, Luke, I said quietly. They're planning something. Vanessa is convinced I'm trying to steal you away. What? He sounded genuinely shocked. That's crazy. I just want to leave. This has nothing to do with you. I know, I said quickly, but they don't see it that way. They think if you leave, it's because I made you. Silence on the other end. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. What do I do? He whispered, his voice small and scared. I just want to get out. I don't want to fight them. We're going to help you, I said firmly, but you have to trust us. No more going back, no more second guessing. If you really want out, we'll get you out, but it has to be for good. I'm sure, he said immediately. I'm done. I need a way out. Over the next week, we put the plan into motion. Luke found a small studio apartment in a different part of the city, far enough away from Dad and Vanessa that they couldn't just drop by whenever they wanted. He moved in quietly without making a fuss. No big announcements, no confrontations. We wanted to keep it as low-key as possible, but, of course, nothing ever goes that smoothly, The day after he moved, Vanessa showed up at his new place. I don't know how she found out. Maybe she'd been tracking him, maybe she'd gone through his things before he left. But there she was, pounding on his door and screaming for him to let her in. "Open up, Luke!" she yelled, her voice shrill and panicked. "You're making a huge mistake. We can fix this. Just come home and we'll figure it out." Luke called me, his voice shaking. "What do I do? She's not leaving." "Stay calm," I told him, trying to keep my own panic in check. "Don't open the door. Just call the police." "Are you sure?" he whispered. "She'll hate me forever if I do that." "Luke," I said firmly, "she's already trying to manipulate you. If you let her in, you'll never get out. Call the cops." He hung up, and I sat there clutching my phone, praying he'd listen. A few minutes later, I got a text. "Called them. She's gone." I breathed a sigh of relief, but I knew this was just the beginning. Vanessa wasn't going to give up that easily, and neither was Dad. For the next few weeks, it was like we were living in a war zone. Vanessa and Dad started showing up everywhere. Luke's job, his new place, even trying to follow him around town. They'd bombard him with texts, calls, voicemails, alternating between begging him to come back and threatening to cut him off completely. And then, one day, they just stopped. No calls, no visits, no angry messages, nothing. "I don't like this," Jake said one night, frowning at his phone. "It's too quiet." "Maybe they've finally given up," I suggested, though I didn't believe it for a second. But they hadn't given up. They were just changing tactics. 2 days later, Luke called me in a panic. "They're suing me," he blurted out, his voice trembling. "What?" I felt like the ground had just dropped out from under me. "For what?" "Something about financial support," he said breathlessly. "I don't even know what it means. They're saying I owe them money for everything they paid for over the years, like they're trying to get me to come back by draining me dry." Okay, calm down," I said, my mind racing. "We'll figure this out. Just send me everything they sent you." Luke forwarded me the legal documents, and as I read through them, my blood boiled. It was all nonsense, baseless claims and exaggerated expenses. They were throwing everything they could at him, hoping something would stick. But it was clear what this was really about. Control. They couldn't have him, so they were trying to break him instead. "We need a lawyer," I told Jake, my voice shaking with anger. "They're not going to stop until they've ruined him." Jake nodded grimly. "I'll call the guy who helped us before." We lawyered up fast, and the battle began. It was ugly. Long hours of meetings, legal back and forth, and emotional turmoil. Vanessa and Dad showed up at every hearing, glaring daggers at us from across the room. But Luke held his ground. He stayed strong, even when it seemed like they were throwing everything they had at him. Finally, After what felt like an eternity, the judge ruled in Luke's favor. The lawsuit was thrown out. Vanessa and Dad stormed out of the courtroom, fuming, but it was over. Luke was free. We celebrated that night, nothing fancy, just the three of us and a couple of beers in Luke's tiny studio. But it felt like a victory, A hard-won, bloody victory. "Thank you," Luke said quietly, looking at Jake and me with a kind of gratitude I'd never seen before. "I know I messed up, and I know I don't deserve this, but thank you for not giving up on me." "Your family," Jake said simply. "We don't leave family behind." Luke's eyes welled up, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were really brothers again. Dot. After that, things finally started to settle. Vanessa and Dad stayed quiet, licking their wounds. Maybe they'd finally realized they couldn't control us anymore. Maybe they were just biding their time. But for now, we had peace. Luke started building his own life. He got a new job, made new friends, and slowly began to find his footing. He wasn't the same kid who'd been caught between us all those years ago. He was stronger, more sure of himself. And seeing that made all the pain and chaos we'd gone through feel worth it. As for Jake and me, we kept moving forward too. We built a new life in our new city, one that wasn't defined by the ghosts of our past. We found joy in the little things, weekend trips, late-night movie marathons, just being together as a family. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe one day Dad and Vanessa will try to weasel their way back in. Maybe Luke and I will drift apart again. Maybe everything will come crashing down all over again. But right now, in this moment, I'm just happy. We made it through the storm. We fought back, we stood our ground, and we won. And that's enough for me. Story 2, expelled at 16 for being pregnant with my entitled twins. They want to live with me now. I've always known I'm not wanted. Furthermore, I'm not claiming that I was an accident throughout the entire oops. My parents have expressed their wish to have only one child. My sister, who is twins. Yes, they informed me up front that they were just after her. Some bonus they never asked for, I thought. It's really screwed up, huh? It seemed as like I was living in someone else's family when I was growing up. The star of the show was my sister, Sarah, for short. She fulfilled every wish they had ever had. They also ensured that she was aware of it. She had a lovely designed room with pink curtains, a Disney duvet, and shelves brimming with toys. She resembled the home's tiny princess. In contrast, I was essentially the background extra, my space. It was a small room with a dresser that had most likely been there since the 1970s and an old bed that creaked whenever I moved. It felt like a slap in the face every morning. When I would wake up, I would hear my parents chatting about how excited they were to purchase Sarah new clothing, take her to gymnastics, or do something else. It was up to me to decide how I would spend my day in the interim. It seems as though they were unaware of my presence, and if they were only telling me to move aside. I understand. How come you can't resemble your sister more? It felt like my name so often. Nor was it limited to the house. There was no escape from school. This happened once during parent-teacher conferences, as I recall. Sarah's finger paintings had everyone enthralled the entire time, treating her like a Picasso. My teacher handed them my report card in the meantime, but they didn't even glance at it. It appeared to be non-existent. I was working really hard at school because I thought that maybe, just maybe, if I did well enough, people might notice me. However, it was useless. I was just there, Sarah the beautiful child. She really did have everything. The attention and the lovely outfits, even dinner time, first dibs on food. She has an entire wardrobe that changed with the seasons. In the meantime, almost everything in my clothing was a hand-me-down from distant cousins. Some of those garments, I swear, were older than me. And every birthday and Christmas was the same. Sarah would receive gifts galore, but I would only receive 1 or 2 items. Enough to let them claim I had received anything. I used to sit there and pretend not to worry about it, watching her open her presents with a phony smile. However, it did. It was also more than just the material things. Sure, having brand new toys or stylish clothing would have been awesome, but the simple things were what really hurt. Sarah's toys resembled priceless artifacts. My parents would hurry over if I even touched one of her dolls. She would scream. If I was only observing it, it made no difference. I was always to blame. If I showed her any disrespect or was irresponsible, I would be reprimanded. Man, it felt like they viewed me as a potential danger to her well-being and mealtimes. Those were difficult. Sarah would always choose everything first. Largest pizza slice, the best part of the bird, whatever. I would take the remainder. And if I grumbled, my mother would give me this look and tell me to be happy that I was receiving anything at all. It, quote, s, as if they were feeding me as a favor, treating me like an outsider. My grandfather was the only one who gave me a sense of belonging. He was unique. I wasn't treated like an invisible person by him. On the weekends, I visit his property, where he takes me fishing or just sits on the porch and tells me stories about his early years. You know, he made me feel like I was valuable, as if I were more than simply the ugly twin for a few hours every week. I felt like an ordinary child, not some unwelcome tag-along. But he later fell ill. Cancer. It seemed like my parents were trying to keep me out of it even back then. They would bring Sarah flowers to present him when they visited him. But I was always advised to remain indoors. They made up the ridiculous excuse that they required my assistance around the house. It served as just another reminder that I was an outsider in their eyes. I would sneak out to see him by myself. He would try to lift my spirits throughout our conversations by complimenting me on my strength and saying he was glad I persisted. However, I could sense his concern. It felt like the one positive thing in my life was taken away when he died. My parents, I recall, didn't even inquire as to my well-being. They were too preoccupied making sure Sarah was handling everything smoothly, as if she were the only person at the funeral who had experienced a loss. It was as if they were ashamed to be seen with me, because they had her standing at the front with them and me pushed to the rear. I never felt more alone than I did at that moment. Things worsened further following the passing of my grandfather. The minor acknowledgments I used to receive, such as the occasional good job when I completed a household task, have all but vanished. It was as though I was vanishing and turning into a ghost in my own house. My parents used to talk to Sarah at the dinner table as if I wasn't even present. Family portraits. Let's just say that my elbow and the back of my head have quite the collection. I'm very sure no one would even know I existed if they went through our family photo album. I could feel the resentment eating away at me. Sometimes I try to advocate for myself. I used to ask my mom why I never got anything new when my sister got a new dress, and she would always respond, "Well, Sarah's got her activities and events, and you're fine with what you have." I would also get scolded for being conceited and making everything about me if I persisted in pushing. I thus learned to speak my mind quietly. I got exceptionally good at disappearing into the background in order to avoid hearing such remarks ever again. However, the remarks persisted even when I made an attempt to vanish. In particular, my dad had a habit of treating me like a broken object that needed to be fixed. "You should get in shape, son," he would remark. "How come you can't resemble your sister more?" He seemed to sincerely think that me, simply by being, was the one making mistakes. Naturally, Sarah was more than delighted to participate in that. My parents would always be the first to rush to her side when she asked for something. It didn't matter what I did, as I quickly discovered. They were never going to choose me. That's the thing about feeling unwelcome as a child. It begins to play havoc with your mind. You begin to think that perhaps you are the root of the issue. I tried for years to understand what was wrong with me, why I couldn't just be their son. I used to wish I could vanish and make things simpler for them as I would lie awake at night and stare at the ceiling, since they gave me that impression, as if my presence was only making their life more difficult. I can understand now how toxic all of that was looking back. However, as a child, you are unaware of this. All you want is to be welcomed and loved. And you put the blame on yourself when you don't receive that. If only I could be better, if only I could be quieter, if only I could try harder. Perhaps they would eventually see me. However, they never did. I became 16, considering. Okay, I'm halfway to leaving this location. I was eagerly awaiting the day I would be able to legally leave and pursue my dreams. However, I was unprepared for what happened next. I've always known my sister is the family favorite. However, the subsequent events still seemed like a blow to the face. Being made to feel as though you don't belong is one thing, but being pushed out the door is quite another. So Sarah became pregnant at 16? Yes. At 16, he's already playing house. Who was the father, by the way? A 19-year-old man who hardly completed high school is employed in unfulfilling positions. The kind of guy that leaves you wondering if he truly understands what it takes to be responsible. I assumed there would be a serious discussion about the repercussions and how her life would alter when my parents learned, but instead, they pretended as though she had returned with a medal or something. They were genuinely happy, like an odd kind of excitement. It was all about our young daughter growing up and our impending grandparenthood. I stood there, reflecting. Do we share this same reality? They planned Sarah and her boyfriend's hastily called wedding. It went by so quickly you would have thought they were attempting to set a record. I was spending most of my time in my room, so one day I'm sitting there since it felt safer. And the following one? We're heading to a wedding, so they're telling me to get dressed. Nobody even inquired as to whether I was okay with the whole situation. It felt like the biggest joke. Not that my opinion ever mattered. And then the real explosion went off a few weeks later. When my mother calls me downstairs, she's wearing a smile that I've come to detest over the years. She always uses the same one just before saying something she knows I won't like. She begins to discuss how they will require more space now that Sarah's new baby is on the way. As I sit there, I ask myself, well, why are you telling me this? That's when she lets go of it. We must use your room for the infant. I was taken aback. My space, the one location that truly belonged to me. Even though it was the tiniest, dirtiest room in the house, it was the one place I could convince myself that everything was all right for a mere 5 minutes. I attempted to argue, but then I wondered what I should do. My mother simply shrugs and tells me that I'm old enough to work things out. She really said that I ought to be thankful that they allowed me to remain there for as long as they did. I was 16. In what way was I expected to solve it on my own? They were aware that I had nowhere to go. They didn't care, though. All they had to do was clear space for the priceless grandchild, and it was simplest to get rid of me. I recall my dad supporting my mom as usual, just standing there with his arms crossed. Look, you're a young man now, he says. It's time for you to start looking out for yourself, as though it were perfectly acceptable to throw out your teenage child because they chose to act like adults. So I packed my stuff that evening. What little I had, anyway. It wasn't very much. My grandfather gave me a few bags of clothes, books, and other items before he went away. One final glance around my room, I recall thinking that, although it wasn't much, at least it was mine. I was out on the street, and it was going to become a nursery for my sister's child. They dismissed my attempt to ask where I was meant to go with a shrug. My dad said, "We're sure you'll work something out." "We're doing this for your sister," my mom continued. "She needs us right now." I was itching to yell. "How about me? When have you ever needed me?" But I knew it wouldn't change anything. They'd already made up their minds. And I was just an inconvenience standing in the way of their beautiful family fantasy. I thus took the only action that occurred to me. I fetched an old tent from the garage and set it up in the backyard. It was all I had, but it wasn't much. Though the ground was hard and the evenings freezing, at least I was near enough to the house to hear them. Not that it improved my mood. I could hear them talking about the baby, laughing and eating dinner. It felt as though I were a stray puppy that had been placed outdoors where it could be watched over, but kept far enough away to not cause any trouble. Things really started to go terrible when winter arrived. Despite my best efforts to stay warm, I could still feel the cold seeping into my bones. Yes, comma. I was still trying to stay up with school, so I did my homework with a flashlight. I would try to study my textbooks while shivering and sitting in 3 layers, but my grades began to suffer. It was difficult to concentrate on algebra when you're shivering and not sure if you'll survive the night. Naturally, comma, my parents were unaware of it as well. They were too preoccupied with getting my old room decorated and ready for Sarah's new family. I was just the outside ghost, the one they no longer had to be concerned about. I recall occasionally observing them through the kitchen window while they ate and conversed as like nothing was wrong. As if I wasn't standing a few feet away, feigning indifference while fighting for warmth, I made an effort to work odd jobs to save money, raking snow and cutting grass, anything I could manage. I used to go around the neighborhood knocking on people's doors to see if they needed assistance. The majority of folks treated me like a pauper. However, a handful offered me jobs, and I was appreciative of every cent I earned. Though small, it was plenty to purchase food. I would steal back to my tent with leftovers or a meal and act as though I was going camping on purpose. The fact that my grandfather would not have allowed this to occur if he were still living was the worst part. If I had been adopted by him, not a single question was raised, but I was on my own without him. I considered going to a friend's house, but I knew everyone in our tiny town had already heard my parents' version of events. I was the one who caused problems by refusing to follow their guidelines. They gave the impression that I chose to live outside. Making ensuring their idyllic small family image persisted was the main concern. I realized I couldn't keep doing this one night as I lay in the tent and listened to the wind howl outside. They definitely weren't coming to aid me, so I had to work things out on my own, I realized at that point. They showed no concern at all. Without hesitation, they had forced me out. To them, I was insignificant. Only some additional burdens they were unwilling to handle. I thus came to a decision. I had had enough of attempting to gain their favor. I refused to be the child they disregarded and held responsible for everything. It's okay if they didn't want me. I was going to solve my own problems. I knew one thing for sure, even if I wasn't sure how yet. I had no intention of hanging out in that backyard in the hopes of getting permitted back in. With or without them, I was going to find a way out and survive. Being isolated and living in a tent served as a continual reminder of this. To be honest, I was becoming hopeless. The nights seemed to go on forever during the harsh winter. I realized I needed to take action. I'd been performing odd jobs around the neighborhood to save up what little money I could scrounge together. However, it wasn't sufficient to have a significant impact. With my hands hurting from the cold and my stomach rumbling as I fell asleep, I would tell myself that this couldn't go forever. I was still attempting to go one day after school even though my grades were completely failing. I was standing outside one of the neighborhood bakeries. I used to smell the freshly baked pastries and bread as I would walk past it every day. I was more hungry than usual that day. I must have appeared disorganized, observing the display window while standing there. Since the proprietor, an elderly man by the name of Frank, approached me and inquired if I required anything. I tried to play it cool and just kind of blew it off because I really didn't know what to say. Frank, though, wasn't buying it. He had no trouble seeing right through me. He had a strong voice and a demeanor that suggested he had seen hardships before. He was one of those no-nonsense kinds. He inquired, "You want a job, young one?" I nodded without giving it a second thought. I thought I had my chance. He mentioned that he required assistance with deliveries, floor sweeping, and general housekeeping. He would give me $20 and include some day-old bread, nothing fancy. I had the impression that I had won big. I would no longer go to bed in that tent empty-handed. My first day at work wasn't the best. The bakery was open early. When I say early, I mean far before the sun had a chance to rise. I got up at 4 in the morning and made my way there in the pitch darkness. But the warmth struck me as soon as I entered those doors. And I thought, yeah, I can handle this. Frank gave me a tour of the area, pointing out tasks that needed to be completed and outlining his strict no-slacking policy. Despite the hard effort and the pain in my back from lifting big flour bags and scrubbing floors, I didn't mind. I had somewhere to be, and being productive felt nice. Frank was not the kind to give hugs and kisses, but eventually we became friends. He would regale me with tales of how he had founded the bakery shortly after being expelled by his own father for misbehaving. He had constructed everything from the ground up, and I believe he recognized a small portion of himself in me. He began offering me financial advice, and even offered to show me how to make some of the easier pastries. It was strange, but I felt like someone genuinely cared about what had happened to me for the first time in a long time. Frank informed me that he had an empty tiny room above the bakery after he had been working there for a few weeks. It was essentially a storage area, but he offered for me to crash there if I so desired. I was really appreciative because it was an improvement over the tent. That night, I moved my belongings in. I was relieved to have a roof over my head even if the room was small, with only a single bed and a window that opened very little. I had not slept that well in months. It felt like a big thing to have somewhere to go when I woke up every day. I gave the work my all. I reasoned that working myself to the bone would be the least I could do if Frank was giving me a shot. I acquired the ability to properly knead dough, create the ideal loaf of bread, and even bake a respectable apple pie. Frank was fair, tough, and he would nod or grunt at me when I did anything well. Even though it wasn't much, I treasured those small moments beyond everything else. Frank took me aside after my shift one day. He was wearing a stern expression, the type that suggested I was in danger. However, he gave me an envelope instead. He said, "You've been doing good work, kid. This is your first official paycheck." When I opened it, I saw more money inside than I had ever seen in one location. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me hope that I was at last headed in the right direction. I felt like I was moving forward instead of stagnating for the first time. My job at the bakery turned into a habit. I used to get up early, go to work until the afternoon, and then utilize the free Wi-Fi at the library to hunt for additional work chances. The bakery was providing me with the necessary stepping stone, even though I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I tried to save every last dime, living as though I was still in that tent and limiting my spending to necessities. Frank suggested that I take the day-old bread and use it for a few meals. To keep costs down, I would also buy dollar store soup cans. I never really discussed my predicament with Frank, but I believe he knew more than he was willing to admit. He gave me a set of keys one evening after we closed in case you ever needed to lock up. Playing it off like it wasn't a huge problem, he said, but I understood its meaning. It was faith. It meant a lot to me that he trusted me with his place. Even though I had no family to watch out for me, I had the strange impression that Frank was doing so in a quiet, stern manner. I persevered because of my routine in the bakery, although things weren't always easy. On certain days, I felt like everything was heavy. Families would enter the bakery as I observed, parents and children together having fun as they choose snacks. It resembled a gut punch. I had to go into the back room every time to collect my breath. A part of me was still in shock that my own family had treated me like a nothing and ejected me, while total strangers showed me more compassion than my parents had ever shown. I, however, was not going to allow those thoughts defeat me. You either let life beat you or you stand up and beat it right back, Frank used to tell me. For me, it started to act as a mantra. I had no intention of giving up, not after what I'd experienced. I would return to that room above the bakery every day, and I would swear to myself. I was determined to persevere, to keep working hard, and to create something better for myself. Frank arrived one morning, appearing more worn out than normal. He merely grunted and murmured something about getting old when I asked him how everything was doing, but he also gave me this look that almost felt like a warning. It was as though he was warning me not to get too cozy. At the moment, I didn't give it any thought. I assumed he was simply having a difficult day. I couldn't shake those words, though. I realized he was correct. I had to leave the bakery eventually. It was a secure area. Yes, but I had to start thinking more broadly. I then began requesting more work from others. I took on more shifts at a nearby convenience shop and occasionally assisted with landscaping, anything to earn a little more dollars. Although juggling everything wasn't simple, I was committed to saving enough money to upgrade to something better. I felt like I was finally in charge of my own life the more I worked. I felt exhausted on some days since it was difficult. Still, I had to constantly remind myself of my motivation. It wasn't enough for me to survive. My goal was to create a life in which my only source of dependence was myself. I consider myself fortunate to have found Frank at that bakery when I look back. It went beyond a job. It was the first concrete step in organizing my life. I felt like I had a chance, even though for the first time things were still unclear. An actual one. I was no longer just the outsider child living in a tent. It was enough to sustain me knowing I was someone who was bringing about change, even if it was just little steps at a time. I saved every dime and worked myself into the ground for a few years before I succeeded. My own home was purchased. It was just a little 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of town, nothing particularly large or elegant. However, I owned it. The first moment I walked through those doors, clutching the keys and realizing this was my place, I can't even begin to explain. I had a surge of pride as I stood there in the empty living room taking in the stark walls. I had completed it. I had succeeded, and I had done so without assistance from my alleged family. The only furniture I had for the first 2 weeks was an inflatable mattress and a few cardboard boxes that served as a table and a chair. It wasn't easy, but I didn't mind. I would remind myself that this was my place every morning when I woke up. Nobody could expel me. I could not be told I didn't belong. I took my time decorating the space. I would occasionally buy small items when I could afford them. Thrift store couches and inexpensive dining tables are examples of such items. It was starting to come together, and I had the impression that I was creating a true home with each piece of furniture I added. My doorbell rang one day, just as I was beginning to feel at ease. I didn't give it much thought at first. I assumed it was a delivery or even a visit from a neighbor. However, I felt as though I had been hit in the stomach as I opened the door. They were there. My parents. Sarah, her husband, and their 3 children, grinning as if nothing had occurred, were standing on my porch, as if they hadn't abandoned me and left me to fend for myself years ago. It was my mother who spoke first. "Whoa!" She spoke as though she were announcing a significant reunion. "You reportedly purchased a home. We're so happy for you." I just stood there, trying not to show emotion while holding on to the doorknob. A part of me was just shocked, and another part of me wanted to slam the door in their faces. It had been years since I'd seen them, but here they were, posing as like nothing was wrong. Sarah moved forward, carrying her infant on her hip, and surveyed my foyer as though evaluating it. "Nice location, dude. You've accomplished a great deal for yourself." That's when it dawned on me. This visit wasn't merely cordial. They have a purpose for being here. My family had never been one to come up except when they were in need. My father cleared his throat, as though he were going to deliver one of his iconic speeches. "We were thinking, son, with Sarah's family expanding in any way. And you're all alone in this large house. Perhaps it's time to move on from past grievances. Families ought to stick together, don't they?" I nearly burst out laughing at him. "Relatives?" When I was a teenager, these people had thrown me out like trash. They were now discussing family. With a growl in my throat, I bit back and made myself ask, "What are you really asking for?" My mother came forward, grinning. "We reasoned that it would be great if we all moved in together. One large, content family akin to the past. She asked me to give up the one thing I had worked so hard for, and she did it with such casualness. The memories of sleeping in a tent and being disregarded and handled like a problem were causing me to become more and more enraged. And now they desired to move into the house I had constructed myself. "No," I spoke, attempting to maintain a steady tone. "That isn't taking place." The grins vanished. My mother's expression contorted, as if she was shocked that I was declining. But she persisted. "We're family," as if things were meant to have some significance. We ought to be supporting one another. I took a deep breath and tried to remain composed as I felt my hands begin to shake. When I was 16 and camped out in the backyard, where had that attitude gone? Where was family then, I wondered. They were silent for a brief while. My dad reddened and heaved out his chest, the way he did every time he tried to scare me. "Now pay attention to this." "No, you pay attention," I interrupted him. "This place was built by me, without your assistance. To get to where I am, I put in daily work. Furthermore, I won't allow you to enter here as if nothing occurred. I don't want you here. This is my house." Sarah's features contorted into this mask of pain. "Please don't be so egocentric. You owe us the space and we need it. That was the last straw. I'm obliged to you. I lost my temper. I owe you nothing at all. I was kicked out by you all when I was a child. Left me empty-handed. And you suddenly believe that you can just show up and assume control? Leave now!" My dad's face flushed even more, and for an instant, I thought he was going to scream, but instead he just looked at me as if he had never seen me before. Perhaps he finally noticed that I was no longer that scared little child. The one who, when he spoke his opinion, would always yield. I was not going back now. My mother gave it one last go. She seemed to be attempting to guilt me with her softer voice. "Although we are aware of our errors, we are working to put things right. All we want is to reunite as a family." I wasn't falling for it, though. "You desire to start a family?" I said. "I have something you want now, but it doesn't operate that way. It's necessary for you to move on since I have." For several more moments, they remained motionless, gazing at me as if they were in disbelief at what they were hearing. But in due course, they turned and departed, into their vehicle without saying anything further. As I watched them drive away, I experienced an odd mixture of relief, sadness, and rage. I had been waiting for them for a very long time, hoping that they would eventually show up and be the family I needed. However, once they arrived, I came to the realization that I no longer wanted them in my life. They were unnecessary for me. I closed the door and took a deep breath, leaning against it. Even though my hands were still trembling, I felt a wave of liberation pass through me. It felt amazing to finally stand up for myself. I let their treatment to define me and to make me feel little and unimportant for years. I had my own life and house now, though, and I had had enough of letting them have that. I had a sneaking suspicion that this wouldn't be the last time. People that are toxic don't simply go away when you tell them no. For now, though, I thought I'd made a start. I was learning self-sufficiency and how to defend my property. Most importantly, learn how to refuse without feeling bad about it. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in a long time when I took a seat in my now empty living room. I owned this space. It was not about satisfying anyone's expectations. It was an endeavor to construct something for myself. I didn't require anybody's blessing. I didn't require their approval. I was at last living my life how I wanted it, and I wasn't going to allow anyone to rob me of that. It was a few weeks since my sister and dad had visited me at home. I believed that I had finally let them know they were no longer welcome in my life. I was in error. People that are toxic have a method of regaining control over others, even after you've shut every door. And just when I believed I was finally free to go on, they came up with yet another scheme to deceive me. The beginning was a letter. One day, I discovered this official-looking envelope in my mailbox when I got home from work. I felt a little panic. I'd been doing all the right things, keeping my nose clean, paying my bills on time, but something seemed wrong, I knew. When I tore it open, a legal notice was inside. It stated that my sister was attempting to challenge my claim to the house, arguing that it ought to be owned jointly by the family. My initial thought was incredulity. I was standing in my driveway, gazing at the paper as though it were written in a foreign tongue. This was the one item they really couldn't let me have, could they? The following day, I made a legal call. I was not going to allow them to take away the one thing I had given my lawyer my all for. Karen was a no-nonsense woman. Yes. It was obviously ironic. Even though they are without a leg to stand on, they will make an effort to cause you trouble. She was accurate. They made every effort to drag me through the mud over the following 3 weeks. They said that I had stolen their money and used it to purchase the home. They made an effort to portray me as an ungrateful child who abused their kindness. Everything was false. Both they and I were aware of it. However, that didn't stop them from attempting to paint me in a negative light. I began receiving calls from relatives, friends, and cousins that I hadn't spoken to in years. Individuals who were unaware of my experiences. "What is the purpose of your actions?" they would inquire. "How come you can't just let your family inside?" It was annoying. No one was interested in finding out the truth. After hearing my parents' version of events, they felt I was the bad guy. I had the impression that I was that child again. No matter what, they ignored the person who was always incorrect. But I was no longer that child. I refused to allow them to interfere with my life. I retreated as a result. I collected every invoice and record demonstrating that I had saved my own money, taken on my own employment, and supported myself without their help. I then made the decision to go one step farther. I was curious as to how precisely they believed they were entitled to my home. I thus requested that my attorney examine the family's financial documents. A few weeks subsequently, she summoned me to her workspace. I assumed it would be simply another revision, but when I stepped in, her expression spoke it all, like she had discovered something significant. She gave me a bundle of documents. She said, "You have to see this." And I knew that things weren't going to turn out well. Everything changed when I learned this. My parents had been keeping a lot from me, it turns out. Do you recall the one and only person in my life who truly showed me love? My grandfather? Well, he had given me an inheritance when he passed away, quite a large one, in fact. My parents had found a way to obtain possession of the money, which was meant to be given to me when I reached 18. For years, they had been funding her sister's wedding, her husband's failing business, their own debt repayment, and even a portion of the down payment for their new home with that money. And without uttering a word, With trembling hands, I perused the materials as I sat there. I couldn't decide if it was betrayal, rage, or both. They would allow me to live in a tent while they made purchases with money that was rightfully mine. I used to wonder why I was never good enough all those nights, why they didn't seem to care, and it was because they saw me only as a money source. I was enraged. They were living nicely off of what was legitimately mine, while I had been struggling and pushing myself to the bone during that entire time. I felt foolish for not learning sooner and for not asking why, in my younger years, they always seemed to live beyond their means. But my main emotion was rage. I'm mad with myself for thinking they would genuinely give a damn, angry at them for taking advantage of me. That's when I realized I couldn't let it go. My house was going to be taken by them, the single item I had constructed for myself. I was determined to reclaim everything that they had taken from me. My attorney concurred. We had strong evidence. She suggested that we sue them for theft and fraud. That wouldn't be simple. However, we have the proof, and she was sure we could prevail. I was prepared to go above and above. The money was no longer the main concern. Justice was at issue, about claiming my own rights and demonstrating that I was more than simply the unproductive son. When it fit them, they could discard. I quote, am very sure my parents were surprised when they received the paperwork in the mail. My phone rang nonstop, with calls from my dad, my sister, and my mother all saying they simply wanted to chat. Yes, exactly. Now that they were at last facing penalties, they wanted to discuss. I remained silent. I had had enough of their shenanigans. The ensuing several months were filled with non-stop court dates and legal consultations. They made every effort to portray me as the villain, portraying me as an ungrateful youngster who only desired to harm his own family. However, the evidence was self-evident. Every time they attempted to fabricate some SOB tale, my attorney would present another document demonstrating how they had embezzled funds intended for me. It was excruciating to watch them struggle. However, it was also the first time I experienced a sense of authority. I was no longer the terrified, defenseless child. I was retaliating when the decision was ultimately made. It felt as though a burden had been removed from me. The court decided in my favor. Along with damages, they had to give me back whatever they had taken. I will never forget the expressions on their faces when the verdict was read. They were unable to reason their way out of it for the first time. They were unable to change the story. They were aware that they were in court. I experienced a sense of finality that day that I hadn't had in years as I left the courthouse. Recovering the money was not the main goal. It was about realizing that I was more than just the useless son they painted me as. I had demonstrated my ability to advocate for myself. I also felt liberated from their authority for the first time. They have made a couple additional attempts to get in touch since then. They've tried expressing regret and a desire to make things right. However, I now know better. When you only apologize after you've been made to bear the consequences of your actions, they are meaningless. I made it plain that they are no longer a part of my life by blocking their numbers. I'm concentrating on going forward now. My life, my career, and my home are all things I created from the ground up. Although I know the road ahead is lengthy, I'm prepared for it. And I've discovered that even in cases when they are family, the best course of action is to distance yourself from those who have harmed you. Since family isn't really about blood in the end, it's about having people who stand by you, encourage you, and don't treat you like an afterthought. Though I'm not sure what the future may bring, one thing is certain. What I've earned, I'm not letting anyone take away, not any longer.